A pair of important glands are the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are glands that sit up on the top of the kidney, although they're not actually part of the kidney and don't participate in the urinary system at all. They're endocrine organs. That just happens to be where they're located. If you slice through an adrenal gland, you can see that it has two parts. We have the inner part of the gland called the medulla. The medulla is responsible for releasing epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. This is what stimulates the fight or flight response, this rush of adrenaline that gets released into the bloodstreams as the result of a sudden fright or other excitement. Epinephrine is a monoamine hormone that travels easily through the blood, binds to receptors on the outside of the cells, and has a number of important effects, including increasing the heart rate and the strength of contraction so you can circulate more blood, increasing the blood pressure so that you can push blood where it needs to go, dilating the blood vessels in the muscles so that you're getting more blood going to the muscles, and constricting blood vessels in your viscera, in your digestive, in your reproductive, and your urinary organs, because you don't need a lot of blood going to there if you're worried about running or fighting. There are also changes in your respiratory system, changes to the pupils, changes to the alertness in the brain. A lot of different effects result when epinephrine is released from the adrenal medulla. The outer part of the adrenal gland is the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex releases steroid hormones. It releases more than one type of hormone, but we're only going to focus on one. I want to look at cortisol. Cortisol is an important hormone that helps adapt the body to long-term stress. I already mentioned that it's a steroid hormone, so it's made from cholesterol. That means that it's non-polar. And its release is controlled, like we saw with thyroid hormone, starting with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland releases adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone goes through the blood to the adrenal glands and stimulates them to release cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Cortisol is regulated by negative feedback. The presence of cortisol in the blood goes back up to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and stops the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone. So then we release less cortisol. We see an increase in cortisol release stimulated from signals going to the hypothalamus in cases of stress and in sleep deprivation, both of which seem to happen pretty regularly with college students. Because cortisol is nonpolar, it doesn't dissolve easily into the blood, and it's carried through the blood bound to carrier proteins. So there's a protein in the blood that will bind to the cortisol and help it travel through the blood. Only about 4% of the cortisol in your blood is free. 96% is going to be bound to a protein. Once the cortisol gets to its target cell, it has to release from that protein that helped carry it around so that it can cross through the membrane without help. Once cortisol is inside the cell, it binds to an intracellular receptor, that's a receptor found inside the cell, and it's transported into the nucleus where it can affect what's going on with the production of proteins from the DNA. As we saw with thyroid hormone, cortisol affects almost all of the cells in the body. It does affect different cells a little bit differently depending on exactly which type of cortisol receptor that cell has, but it affects almost everything in the body. The effects of cortisol include increasing your blood glucose level. Cortisol increases the blood glucose level by stimulating the breakdown of glycogen, by stimulating the liver to make more glucose, and by reducing the action of insulin. The more cortisol you have, the less active your insulin is. So those three things together give cortisol the ability to keep your blood glucose level high. In the shorter term, this can be good to provide adequate energy for the cells, but over the long term, this can lead to an increase in insulin resistance, which means your body doesn't respond to insulin very well anymore, and you have elevated glucose levels chronically, which is the condition of diabetes mellitus. Cortisol also stimulates the kidneys to retain more water to reduce dehydration, and it helps to raise the blood pressure, which again is good if you're in a stressful situation and you need to make sure you have adequate blood circulation, but over the long term can be problematic because high blood pressure leads to problems like damage to the blood vessels, stroke, and other problems. Another action of cortisol is that it suppresses the immune system and reduces inflammation. A reduction in inflammation can be a good thing in some cases, although we need some inflammation because that's part of the healing process for damaged tissue. But suppressing the immune system overall isn't a very good thing because it can lead to an increased risk of illness. It's probably happened to a lot of you before that you have a really stressful week, you're not sleeping right, you're not eating right, your body's pumping out tons of cortisol to keep you going, and at the end of that, you get sick because cortisol suppressed your immune system, and as soon as you were exposed to something, it's got you. The last of the endocrine organs I want to talk about is the pancreas. The pancreas is an interesting organ because it's actually an exocrine organ and an endocrine organ. Its exocrine function is to produce a lot of enzymes and secretions needed to break down the food in your digestive system. So a lot of the pancreas has a system of ducts that takes these exocrine secretions into the small intestine where it can aid in digestion. The endocrine cells of the pancreas are found on the pancreatic islets, also known as the islets of Langerhans. These islets, these little patches of cells in the pancreas, have cells that produce a secretion, a hormone that's going to be released into the bloodstream. There are two main hormones that are released by the pancreas. They are insulin and glucagon, and they have the important function of regulating blood sugar level. Insulin is a peptide hormone, meaning it's made of a string of amino acids. It's actually made of two chains of amino acids that are held together by some covalent bonds. And insulin is responsible for reducing blood glucose level. Insulin is released by the beta cells of the pancreatic islets. The release of insulin is stimulated when the blood glucose level gets too high. What happens is the high blood glucose comes into the beta cells of the pancreas and it stimulates additional production of ATP. This glucose is broken down and we have more ATP. Excess ATP in the beta cells is the signal that we have too much glucose in the blood, and this causes the release of insulin. Being a peptide hormone, insulin is polar, so once it's released it travels easily in the blood, and it goes to a number of target cells, including liver cells and muscle cells. Insulin binds to an insulin receptor that's in the membrane of the target cells, and that activates a change within the target cells. Some of the actions of insulin include increasing the amount of glucose transporters. This allows cells to transport more glucose out of the blood and into the inside of the cell. Insulin also stimulates the production of glycogen, so we take more glucose and string it together to form glycogen so we can store that glucose for later. Insulin also stimulates the adipose cells to make more triglycerides, to store more fat for later, and it reduces the breakdown of fats and proteins because it's trying to encourage the cells to use glucose instead. Insulin also reduces the release of glucagon, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. All of these actions, more glucose transporters, building up more glycogen, storing more things as fat, all of these help the cells to use the glucose, and that's going to reduce the level of glucose in the blood. Remember that epinephrine and cortisol both help raise blood sugar level for the energy that you need for those sorts of stressful situations. They both work by inhibiting the release of insulin. When we have more cortisol and more epinephrine, we release less insulin, and that leaves more glucose in the blood. Insulin is great for reducing blood sugar, but we don't want our blood sugar to go too low. We actually want to maintain a very narrow range of blood sugar. The ideal level of blood glucose is about 90 milligrams per deciliter, and a normal range would go from about 70 to 110. Anything higher than 110 is what's going to stimulate the release of insulin to bring the blood sugar down. But once the blood sugar starts coming down and down and down and it gets below 70, we need a mechanism to bring the blood sugar back up so that we have enough glucose to function. That role goes to the hormone glucagon. Like insulin, glucagon is a peptide hormone. It's about 29 amino acids strung together, so it's going to be polar. Glucagon is released by the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets. When blood glucose level gets too low, those alpha cells of the pancreatic islets will release glucagon. Glucagon release is inhibited by insulin, but stimulated by epinephrine. Because glucagon is a peptide hormone, it dissolves easily in the blood and is transported to the target cells, and it binds to a glucagon receptor on the surface of the target cells. This changes the activity of the cell so that we increase the breakdown of glycogen. That's going to release more glucose to go into the blood. In the liver, it stimulates a process called gluconeogenesis that helps to make new glucose. Cells that have the ability to break down fats and proteins for energy are stimulated to do so, so that instead of using glucose, they're using other energy sources. These actions together all have the result of raising the level of glucose in the blood. Once it gets back above that 70 mark, then we're back in the normal range of blood glucose.